and the muzzane's call to prayer from the big mosque wafted over the shacks and factories. Livestock sounds, roosters, goats, a cowbell and a big bovine sneeze. Babies crying. Women struggled past with their water jugs. He thought about how unreal all this was for most of the people he knew, the union leaders he'd grown up with, his own family. When he talked with them about Webley business, they mocked the unreality of life in games, but what about the unreality of life in Dharavi? Here were 1 million people living a life that many others couldn't even conceive of. "Come on," she said. "We're meeting at the Hotel UP." When he'd come to Dharavi, the hotels on the main road in the Kumbarwada neighborhood had puzzled him, until he found out that hotel was just another word for restaurant. The Webleys liked the Hotel UP, a workers' co-op staffed entirely by women who'd come from villages in the poor state of Uttar Pradesh. It was mutual, the women enjoying the chance to mother these serious children while they spoke in their impenetrable jargon, a blend of Indian English, gamerspeak, Chinese curses, and Hindi, the curious dialect that he thought of as Webly, as in Hindi. The Webleys, roused from their beds early in the morning, crowded in sleepily, demanding chai and masala cokes and dosas and aloo puris. The ladies who owned the restaurant shuttled pancakes and fried potato popovers to them in great heaps. Mala paying for them from a wad of greasy rupees she kept in a small purse she kept before her. Ashok sat beside her on her left hand, and Yasmin sat on her right, eyes half-lidded. The army had been out late the night before, on a group trip to a little filmy palace in the heart of Dharavi, to see 3 movies in a row as a reward for a run of genuinely excellent play. Ashok had begged off, even though he'd been training with the army on Mala's orders. He liked the Webleys, but he wasn't quite like them. He wasn't a gamer, and it would ever be thus, no matter how much fighting he did. "Okay," Mala said. "Options. We can find another cafe. There is the 1000 Palms, where we used to fight." She nodded at Yasmin, leaving the rest unsaid, "when we were still Pinkertons, still against the Webleys. But Banerjee has something on the owner there. I've seen it with my own eyes. Banerjee has something on every cafe in Dharavi," Sushant said. He had been very adventurous in scouting around for other places for them to play, on Yasmin's orders. Everyone in the army knew that he had a crush on Yasmin, except Yasmin, who was seemingly oblivious to it. "And what about Mrs. Dibayendu?" Yasmin said. "What about her business, all the work she put into it?" Mala nodded. "I've called her 3 times. She doesn't answer. Perhaps they scared her, or took her phone off of her. Or, again, she didn't need to say it, or she is dead." The stakes were high. Ashok knew. Very high. And there's something else. The strike has started. Ashok jumped a little. What? It was too early, weeks too early. There was still so much planning to do. He pulled out his phone, realized that he'd left it switched off. Powered it up, stared impatiently at the boot screen, listening to the hubbub of soldiers around him. There were dozens of messages waiting for him, from Big Sister Noor and her lieutenants, from the special operatives who'd been working on the scam with him, from the American boy who'd been coordinating with the mechanical Turks. There had been fighting online and off, through the night, and the Chinese were thronging the streets, running from cops, regrouping. Gamespace was in chaos. And he'd been arguing with drunken thug boys at the cafe, eating aloo puris and guzzling chai as though it was just another day. His heart began to race. "We need to get online," he said. Urgently. Mala broke off an intense discussion of the possibility of getting PCs into a flat somewhere and bringing in a network link to look at him. "Bad as that." He held up his phone. "You've seen. You know. I haven't looked since you came to my place. I knew that there was nothing we could do until we found a place to work. It is bad, then." It wasn't a question. They were all hanging on him. "They need our help," he said. "All right," Mala said. "All right. So, we go and we take over Mrs. Dibayendu's place again. Banerjee doesn't own it. Everyone in her road knows that. They will take our side. They must." Ashok gulped. Force, he remembered the boy, drunk, fearless, eyes flat, the sharp machete trembling. The gaze Mala turned on him was every bit as flat. She could transform like that, in a second, in an instant. She could go from pretty young girl, charismatic, open, clever and laughing to stone-faced General Robotwala, ferocious and uncompromising. Her flat eyes glittered. "Force if necessary, always," she said. "Force. Enough force that they go away and don't come back. Hit them hard. Scare them back to their holes, around the table. 30-some Webleys stared at her, their expressions mirrors of hers. She was their general, and before she came into their lives, they had been Dharavi rats, working in factories sorting plastic, going to school for a few hours every day to share books with 4 other students. Now they were royalty, with more money than their parents earned. Jobs and respect. They'd follow her off a cliff. They'd follow her into the sun. But Yasmin cleared her throat. Force if we must, she said. But surely no more than is necessary, and not even that if we can help it. Mala turned to her, back rigid. Neck corded. Jaw set. Yasmin met her gaze with calm eyes and then smiled, a small and sweet and genuine smile. If the general agrees, of course. And Mala melted, the tension going out of her, and she returned Yasmin's smile. Something had changed between them since the night Mala had attacked them, something had changed for the better. Now Yasmin could diffuse Mala with a look, a smile, a touch, and the army respected it, treating Yasmin with reverence, sometimes going to her with their grievances. Of course, Mala said. No more force than is absolutely necessary. She picked up her cane, topped with a silver skull, a gift from her troops, and made a few vicious swipes in the air, executed with the grace of a fencer. He knew that there was a lead weight in the foot of the cane, and he'd seen her knock holes in brick with a swing. Her densely muscled forearms hardly trembled as she wielded the cane. Behind her, one of the ladies who ran the restaurant looked on with heartbreaking sorrow, and Ashok wondered how many young people she'd seen ruined in her village and here in the city. We go, Mala said, and scraped her chair back. Ashok fell in beside her and the army marched down the main road 3 abreast, causing scooters and motorcycles and goats and 3-wheeled auto rickshaws to part around them. Many times Ashok had seen swaggering gangs of budmashes on the street, had gotten out of their way. Now he was in one, a collection of kids. Just kids, the youngest a mere 13. The eldest not yet 20, led by a limping girl with a long neck and hair in a loose ponytail, and around them, people reacted with just the same fear. It swelled Ashok's heart, the power and the fear, and he felt ashamed and exhilarated. Before the door of Mrs. Dibayendu, Mala stooped and pried a rock from the crumbling pavement with her fingers, unmindful of the filth that slimed it. She threw it with incredible accuracy, bowling it like a cricket ball, crash, into the sheet tin door of the café. Immediately, she bent to pick up another rock, prying it loose before the echoes of the first one had died down. Around them, in the narrow street, heads appeared from windows and doorways, and curious pedestrians stopped to look on. The door banged open and there was the boy who had threatened Ashok earlier, eyes bloodshot and pink even from a safe distance. He held his machete up like a sword, a snarl on his lips. It died as he contemplated the 30 soldiers arrayed before him. Many had produced lengths of wood or iron, or picked up rocks of their own. They stared, unwavering, at the boy. What is it? He was trying for bravado, but it came out with a squeak at the end. The machete trembled. Careful, whispered Ashok, to himself, to Mala, to anyone who would listen. A scared bully was even less predictable than a confident one. Mrs. Dibayendu asked us to come reopen her café for her, Mala said. Gesturing with her phone, held in her free hand. You can go now. The new owner asked us to watch his café, the boy said, and everyone on the street heard both lies. Mala's and the boy's. Ashok tried to figure out how old the boy was. 14. 15. Young, dumb. Drunk and angry and armed. Careful, he whispered again. Mala pocketed her phone and hefted her rock, eyes never leaving the boy. 5, she said. He grinned at her and spat a stream of pink, beetle saliva toward her feet. She didn't move. No one moved. 4. He raised the machete. Point aimed straight at her. She didn't seem to notice. 3. Silence rang over the alley. Someone on a motorbike tried to push through the crowd, then stopped, cutting the engine. 2. The boy's eyes cut left, right, left again. He whistled then, hard and loud, and there was a scrabble of bare feet from the café behind him. 1, Mala said, and raised the rock, winding up like a cricket bowler again, whole body coiled, and Ashok thought. I have to do something. Have to stop them. It's insane. But his mouth and his hands and his feet had other ideas. He remained frozen in place. The boy raised his machete across his chest, and the hand that held it trembled even more. Abruptly, Mala threw The rock flew so fast it made a sizzling sound in the hot, wet morning air, but it didn't smash the boy's head in, but rather dashed itself to pieces against the door frame behind him, visibly denting it. The boy flinched as shattered rock bounced off his bare face and chest and arm and back, a few stray pieces pinging off the machete. "Leave," Mala said. Behind the boy, 5 more boys, crowding out of the doorway, each with his machete. They raised their arms. "Fight," hissed one of the boys, the smallest one. There was something wrong with his head, a web of scar and patchy hair running down the left side as though he'd had his head bashed in or been dragged. Ashok couldn't look away from this little boy. He had a cousin that size, a little boy who liked to play games in the living room and run around with his friends. A little boy with shoes and clear eyes and 3 meals a day, and a mother who would tuck him up every night with a kiss on the forehead. Mala fixed the boy with her gaze. "Don't fight," she said. "If you fight, you lose. Get hurt. Run." The army raised their weapons, made a low rumbling sound that raised to a growl. One of the boys was on his phone, whispering urgently into it. Ashok saw their fear and felt a featherweight of relief. These ones would go. "Not fight. Run," Mala said, and stamped forward. The boys all flinched. And some of the army snickered at them, a hateful sound that he'd heard 1,000 times while in-game, a taunting sound that spread through the ranks like a snake slithering around their feet, and the fear in the boys' faces changed. Became anger. The moment balanced on a thread as fine as spider's silk, the snickering soldiers, the boiling boys, the machetes, the clubs and sticks, the rocks. The moment broke. The smallest boy held his machete over his head and charged them, screaming something wordless, howling, really, a sound Ashok had never heard a boy make. He got 3 steps before 2 rocks caught him, one in the arm and the second in the face, a spray of blood and a crunch of bone and a tooth that flew high in the air as the boy fell backwards as if poleaxed. And the moment shattered. Machetes raised. The remaining 5 boys ran for the army, a crazy look in their faces. Ashok had time to wonder if the little boy lying motionless on the ground was the smaller brother of one of the remaining Badmashes, and then the fight was joined. The tallest boy, the one who'd answered the door that morning and spat at him, hacked his way through 2 soldiers, dealing out deep cuts to their chests and arms, Ashok's face coated with a fine mist of geysering arterial blood, face contorted with rage. He was coming for Mala, standing centimeters from Ashok, and the blood ran off his machete and down his arm. Mala seemed frozen in place, and Ashok thought that he was about to die, to watch her die first, and he tensed, blood roaring in his ears so loudly it drowned out the terrible screams of the fighters around him. Desperate and about to grab for the boy. But as he shifted his weight, Mala barked no at him, never shifting her eyes from the leader, and he checked himself, stumbling a half-step forward. The boy with the machete looked at him for the briefest of instants, and Mala whirled, uncoiling herself, using the weighted skull-tipped cane to push herself off, then whipping out the arm, the gesture he'd seen her mime countless times in battle lessons, and the weighted tip crashed into the boy's forearm with a crack he heard over the battle sounds, a crack that he'd last heard that night so many months before, when Mala and her army had come for him and Yasmin in the night. Ashok, the doctor's son, knew exactly what that crack meant. A blur of fabric as Yasmin danced before him, stooping gracefully to take the machete up, and the boy just watched, eyes glazed, shock setting in already. Yasmin delicately and deliberately kicked him in the kneecap, a well-aimed kick with the toe of her sandal, coming in from the side, and the boy went down, crying in a little boy's voice, calling out for his mother with a sound as plaintive as a baby bird that's fallen from the nest. It had been mere seconds, but it was already over. 2 of the boys were running away, one was sobbing through a bloody mouth. 2 were unconscious. Ashok looked for wounded soldiers. 3 had been cut with machetes, including the 2 he'd seen hurt by the leader as he ran for Mala. Remembering the arterial blood, red and rich. Ashok found its owner first, lying on the ground, eyes half open, breath labored. He pushed his hands over the injury, a deep cut on the left arm that spurted with each of the hammering beats of the boy's chest, and he shouted. A shirt, anything, a bandage, and someone pressed a shirt into his bloody hands and he applied hard pressure, staunching the blood. Someone call for a doctor, he said, making eye contact with Anam, a soldier he had hardly spoken to before. You have a phone. The girl was shivering slightly, but she nodded and patted a handbag at her side. Absent-mindedly swinging the length of iron in her hand. She dropped it. You call the doctor, you understand. She nodded. What will you do? Call the doctor, she said. Dreamily, but she began to dial. He turned and grabbed the hand that had passed him the shirt, and he saw that it was attached to Mala, who had stripped it off of another boy in her army. Her chest was heaving, but her gaze was calm. Hold here, he ordered, without a moment's scruple about dictating to the general. This was first aid, it was what he had been trained for by his father, long before he studied economics, and it brooked no argument. He pressed her hand against the bloody rag and stood, not hearing the crackle of his joints. He turned and found the next injured person, and the next. And then he came to the little boy whose misshapen head had caught his attention. The boy who'd been hit high and low with two hard-flung rocks. The whole front of his jaw was crushed, a nightmare of whitish bone and tooth fragments swimming in a jelly of semi-clotted blood. When Ashok peeled back each eyelid, he saw that the left pupil was as wide as a sewer entrance, and did not contract when he moved away and let the sun shine full on it. Concussion, he muttered to the air, and Yasmin answered. Is that bad? His brain is bleeding. Ashok said. If it bleeds too much, he will die. He said it simply, as if reading from a textbook. The boy smelled terrible, and there were sores on his arms and chest and ankles, swollen, over-scratched and infected insect bites and boils. He has to see a doctor. He looked back to the bleeding soldier. Him too. He found the girl who'd promised to call a doctor. Where is the doctor? He had no idea how much time had passed since he'd told her to call. It could have been 10 minutes or 2 hours. She looked confused. The ambulance, she began. She looked around helplessly. It will come, they said. And now that he listened for it, he heard it, a distant dee-daw, dee-daw. The narrow lane that housed Mrs. Dibayendu's cafe would never admit an ambulance. Without speaking, Yasmin ran for the main road, to hail it. And now that Ashok was listening, he could hear neighbors with their heads stuck out of their windows and doorways, passing furious opinion and gupshup. They cheered on Mala's army, rained curses down on the Budmashes with their machetes, lamented Mrs. Dibayendu's departure, chattered like tropical birds about how she had been forced out, weeping, and chased down the road in the dark of night. Ashok was covered in blood. It covered his hands, his arms, his chest, his face. His lips were covered in dried blood, and there was a coppery taste in his mouth. His shirt and trousers, soaked. He straightened and looked around the crowded lane, up at the chatterers, blinking owlishly. Around him, the soldiers and the wounded. Mala was whispering urgently in Sushant's ear, the boy listening intently. Then he began to move among the soldiers, urging them inside. The Webleys had work to do. The police would come soon, and the people inside the building would have the moral authority to claim it was theirs. The boys with their machetes, injured or gone, would have no claim. Ashok wondered if he would be arrested, and, if he was, whether he'd be able to get out. Maybe his father could take care of it. An important man, a doctor, he could take care. 2 ambulance technicians arrived, bearing heavy bags and collapsed stretchers. They were locals, with Dharavi accents, sent from the Lokmanya Tilak Hospital, a huge pile with a good reputation. Quickly, he described the injuries to the men, and they split up to look at the most serious cases, the deep arterial cut and the concussion. Ashok stayed near the small boy, feeling somehow responsible for him, more responsible than for his own teammate, watched as the technician fitted the boy with a neck brace and then triggered the air canister that filled it. Immobilizing his head carefully, the technician seated a plastic ring in the donut hole center of the brace, over the boy's ruined jaw and nose, so that the plastic wouldn't interfere with his breathing. He unfurled his stretcher, snapped its braces to rigidity and looked at Ashok. You know the procedure. Instead of answering, Ashok positioned himself at the boy's skinny hips, putting a hand on each, ready to roll him up at the same time as the medic, keeping his whole body in line to avoid worsening any spinal injuries. The medic slid the stretcher in place, and Ashok rolled the boy back. For one brief moment, he was supporting nearly all the boy's weight in his hands and the child seemed to weigh nothing, nothing at all, as though he was hollow. Ashok found that he was crying, silent tears that slid down his face, collecting blood, slipping into his mouth, doubly salty blood and tear mixture. Mala silently slipped her arm in his. She was very warm in the oppressive heat of the morning. There would be a rain soon, the humidity couldn't stay this high all day, the water would come together soon and then the blood would wash away into the rough gutters that ran the laneway's length. He was a brave kid, Mala said. Ashok couldn't find a reply. I think he thought that if he charged us with that knife, sliced one of us up, we'd be so scared we'd go away forever. You really understand him, then? Ashok saw Yasmin steal over to them, slip her fingers into Mala's. Mala didn't answer. Yasmin said, "Everyone thinks that you can win the fight by striking first." Mala's arm tightened on Ashok's arm. "But sometimes you win the fight by not fighting." Mala said, "We should call you General Gandhiji. It'd be an honor, but I couldn't live up to Gandhi. He was a great man." Ashok said. Gandhi admitted to beating his wife. He was a great man, but not a saint. He swallowed. No one mentions that Gandhi had all that violence inside him. I think it makes him better, because it means that his way wasn't just some natural instinct he was born with. It was something he battled for, in his own mind, every day. He looked down at the top of Mala's head, startled for a moment to realize that she was shorter than him. He had a tendency to think of her as towering, larger than life. Mala looked up at him and it seemed that her dark eyes were glowing in the hot, steamy air, staring out from under her long lashes. "Controlling yourself is overrated," she said. "There's plenty to be said for letting go." There were so many eyes on them, so many people watching from every corner of the road, and Ashok felt suddenly very self-conscious. Inside, the café was hardly recognizable. It stank like the den of some sick animal that had gone to ground, and one corner had been used as a toilet. Many of the computers had been carelessly moved, disconnecting their wires, and one screen was in fragments on the floor. There were beetle spit streaks around the floor, and empty bottles of cheap, fiery booze so awful even the old drunks in the streets wouldn't drink it. But there was also a photo, much creased and folded, of a worn but still pretty woman, formally posed, holding a baby and a slightly larger boy, whom Ashok remembered from the melee. The baby, he thought, must have been that younger boy, and he wondered what had become of the woman, and how she was separated from the sons she held with so much love. And the more he wondered, the more numb and sorrowful he felt, until the sorrow welled over him in black waves, like a tide coming in, until he buckled at the knees and went down to the floor, and if any of the soldiers saw him hold himself and cry, no one said a word. His papers were intact, mostly, in the back room where he'd worked, and the network connection was still up, and the garbage was all swept out the door and the windows were flung open and soon the sound of joyous combat and soldierly high spirits filled Mrs. Dibayendu's, as it had for so many days before. Ashok fell into the numbers and the sheets, seeing how he could work them with the new dates, and he was so engrossed that he didn't even notice the sudden silence in the café that marked the arrival of a policeman. The policeman, fat, corrupt, an old Dharavi rat himself, and more a creature of the slum than the children, had already gotten an account from the neighbors, heard that the machete-wielding budmashes had been the invaders here, and he wasn't about to get exercised on behalf of 6 little nobodies like them. But when there was a death, there had to be paperwork. Death, Ashok said. The small one. Dead by the time he reached the hospital. Ashok felt as though the floor was dropping away from him and the only thing that distracted him and kept him from falling with it was the gasp of dismay from Yasmin behind him, a sound that started off as an exhalation of breath but turned into a drawn-out whimper. He turned and saw that she had gone so pale that she was actually green, and the doctor's son in him noticed that her pupils had shrunk to pinpricks. The fat policeman looked at her, and his lips twisted into a wet, sarcastic smile. "Everything all right, miss?" "She's fine," Mala said, flatly. She was standing closer to the policeman than was strictly necessary, too short to stare him in the eye, but still she seemed to be looking down. Unconsciously, the policeman shifted his weight back, then took a step back, then turned. "Goodbye, then," he said, brandishing his notebook, containing Ashok's identity card number. All the soldiers had claimed that they were never registered for the card, which Ashok really doubted, but which the policeman didn't question, as the air whistled out of his nostrils and he sweated in his uniform. The rains had finally come. The skies opening like floodgates. The rain falling in sheets the color of the pollution they absorbed on their fall from the heavens. The clatter on the tin walls and roof was like a firefight in some cheap game where the guns all made metallic pong and ping sounds. Ashok watched as Yasmin drifted away into Mrs. Dibayendu's little office, the room where she made the chai over a small gas burner, watched as Mala followed her. He tried to work on his calculations, but he couldn't concentrate until he saw Mala emerge, face slammed shut into her general robotwala expression, but there were still tracks from the tears on her cheeks. She looked straight through him and started to bark orders to her soldiers, who had been setting the cafe to rights and getting all the systems running again. A moment later, they were all clicking, shouting, headsets on, shoulders tight, in another world, and the battle was joined. Ashok found his way into Mrs. Dibayendu's office, found Yasmin squatting by the wall, heels flat on the ground, hands before her. She stared silently into those hands, twining them around each other like snakes. "Yasmin," he whispered. "Yasmin." She looked at him. There were no tears in her eyes, only an expression of bottomless sorrow. "I threw the rock," she said. "The rock that hit that little boy. I threw it. The one that hit him in the mouth. He was." She swallowed. "He was running at us with a machete." Ashok said. "He would have killed us." She chopped her hand through the air, a gesture full of uncharacteristic violence. "We put ourselves in that position, in the position where we'd have to kill him. It was Mala. Mala, she always wants to win before the battle is fought, win by annihilating the enemy." And then to talk of Gandhi, she looked like she was going to punch something, small hands balled in fists, and then, abruptly, she pitched forward and threw up, copiously, a complete ejection of the entire contents of her stomach, more vomit than Ashok had ever seen emerge from a human throat. In between convulsions, he half led, half carried her out of the café, into the all-pounding rain, and let her throw up into the laneway, which had become a rushing river, the rain overflowing the narrow ditches on either side of it. The water ran right up to the cracked slab of cement that served as Mrs. Dibayendu's doorstep, and Yasmin's hijab was instantly soaked as she leaned out to spatter the water's turbulent surface with poris and chai and bile. Her long dress clung to her narrow back and shoulders, and it heaved with them as she labored for breath. Ashok was soaked too, the blood taste in his mouth again as the water washed the dried blood down his face. The rain made talking impossible, so he didn't have to worry about soothing words. At last Yasmin straightened and then sagged against him. He put his arm around her, grateful for the feeling of another human being, that contact that penetrated his numbness. Something passed between them, carried on the thudding of their hearts. Transmitted by their skin, and for a moment, he felt as though here at last, was someone who understood everything about him, and here was someone he understood. The moment ended, ebbing away, until they were standing in an embarrassed, awkward half-hug, and they wordlessly disentangled and went back in. Someone had mopped up the vomit, using the rags that the badmashes had left behind and then kicking them in a reeking ball in the corner. Yasmin sat down at a computer and logged in, listening intently to the chatter around her, catching the order of battle, while Ashok went to his computer and got ready to talk to Big Sister Noor. The day the strike started. Wei Dong was in the midst of his second special assignment. The first one had been to bring over the box of prepaid cards, which had been handed off into the Weebly network to be scratched off and then keyed in and sent to Big Sister Noor so she could portion them out to the fighters. The second assignment was harder in some ways. He was charged with finding other mechanical Turks who might be sympathetic to the strikers' cause and recruit them. Wei Dong had never thought of himself as much of a leader, he'd always been a loner in school, but Big Sister Noor had talked to him at length about all the ways in which he might convince his fellow Turks to consider joining this strange enterprise. Technically, it was simple enough to accomplish. As a Turk, he had access to the leaderboards of Turk activity, which Coca-Cola Online made a big deal out of, updating them every 10 minutes. The leaderboards listed each Turk by name and showed which parts of the game he or she hung out in, how many queries she or he handled per hour, how highly rated the Turks' rulings and roleplay were rated by the players, who were randomly surveyed by a satisfaction bot that gave out rare badges to any player who would fill in an in-game questionnaire.